Right now, off the coast of Greenland, a single ocean current that is roughly 50 times more powerful than every engine, every power plant, and every machine of human civilization combined is running slower than it has in 1600 years. It is the only reason London is not as frozen as Siberia. It is the invisible machine that has quietly kept the entire Northern Hemisphere livable for the whole span of recorded human history. And this year, for the very first time, scientists built an instrument precise enough to read its warning lights, pointed it at 30 years of data we already had, and confirmed something they have never been able to say before. We are now living inside the early stage of its collapse, not a forecast, a measurement. The line we hoped we would never cross is behind us, and the only question left is how much time is on the other side of it. If that lands as heavily on you as it does on me, take a second to subscribe to the Sky Lab, because the slow, world-changing stories that hide in plain sight are exactly what we follow here. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from, and whether the winters where you live have started to feel different than they used to. Trust me, you are going to want to understand this one all the way down. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The line on the map. Take a globe and run your finger along a single line of latitude. Start in London, then travel due east, holding that line as steady as you can. You will pass over the cold middle of Russia. You will cross deep into Siberia, into a land of permafrost and frozen rivers, where winter is a season that can kill an unprepared traveller in a single night. Keep going and you will brush the southern edge of Hudson Bay in Canada, a place that is locked in ice for much of the year. Now stop and look at what you have just done. You have drawn a line that connects one of the most temperate, green, densely populated regions on Earth to some of the harshest cold weather terrain on the planet. And every single point on that line sits at the same distance from the equator. By every law of geography that should matter, London and Siberia are supposed to be the same kind of place. They are not. And the reason they are not is the entire subject of this video. Push the idea a little further, because it only gets stranger. Norway, with its fishing towns and its farms and its cities full of people living ordinary modern lives, lines up almost exactly with the southern tip of Greenland, a place that is essentially a frozen wasteland from edge to edge. Stockholm sits at a latitude that, on the other side of the world, runs through the empty cold of southern Alaska. By all rights, northern Europe should be a frozen tundra for half the year, in the nicest way I can put it. Largely uninhabitable, home to perhaps 1/10 of the people who actually live there today. The cities should not exist at the scale they do. The farms should not be able to feed the populations they feed. The whole northwestern corner of Europe should be a thin scattering of hardy settlements, clinging to the edge of a brutal climate. So why isn't it? Why does this one piece of the world get to break the rules that everywhere else on its latitude has to obey? The answer is not the land. It is not the mountains or the soil or anything you can stand on. The answer is in the water. There is a current in the Atlantic Ocean, a vast moving river of warmth that has been quietly pumping tropical heat northward across the entire ocean basin for thousands of years. It picks up warmth in the Gulf of Mexico, carries it up the coast of North America, and flings it across the open Atlantic toward Europe, where it bleeds that heat into the air. That warm air is what gives Britain its green winters, and Norway its livable coastline, and Northern Europe its entire civilization. Without it, the map you know would simply not be possible. For thousands of years this current has been so reliable that nobody who lived under its protection ever had to think about it. It was just there, the way the ground is there, the way the sun comes up. It is the kind of thing that operates so far in the background of human life that you could build 1,000 years of cities and farms and nations on top of it without ever once acknowledging that it exists, and that is exactly what we did. But here is where the comfortable part of the story ends. Right now, that current is the weakest it has been in roughly 16 centuries. 1,600 years! To put that in perspective, the last time this system was running this slowly, the Western Roman Empire was in its final collapse. Everything we think of as modern European history, every kingdom and cathedral and revolution and war, has happened during a window in which this current was stronger and steadier than it is today. We have never, in the entire span of recorded history, tried to run our civilization on a North Atlantic current this weak. We are in genuinely new territory, and I want to pause on that number, weakest in 16 centuries, because it is the kind of claim that deserves a second look rather than a nod, You might reasonably wonder how anyone could possibly know how strong an ocean current was 1600 years ago, long before there were instruments in the water or satellites in the sky. It is a fair challenge, and the answer is genuinely clever. Currents leave fingerprints. When the AMOC is strong, it arranges the temperature of the ocean surface in a particular pattern, and it sorts the sediment on the seafloor in particular ways, dropping certain grain sizes in certain places depending on how fast the deep water is flowing. Scientists can read those fingerprints. They can pull up cores of mud from the bottom of the Atlantic layer by layer, like pages in a book, and from the grain sizes and the chemistry and the tiny shells of long-dead organisms they can reconstruct, century by century, how vigorously this current was turning over. And when they stitch those records together into one long timeline, the message is consistent and sobering. The decline is real, it is recent, and it has pushed the system to a low it has not seen since the time of the late Roman world. Now think about what that means for our sense of normal. Every human being alive today, every person who has ever advised a government or built a city or written a climate plan, grew up inside a world where this current was simply a fixed feature of reality, like gravity, like the length of the day. We treated its steadiness as a permanent gift rather than a temporary condition. And that is precisely the problem with a thing that moves at the speed of geology. It is so slow, so far in the background, that it never makes it onto the list of things we worry about. There is always something faster and louder demanding attention today. A current that loses a little strength each decade cannot compete, in the human mind, with the news of the afternoon. So it weakens in silence, unwatched and unworried about, until somebody finally adds up the centuries and realizes how far it has already fallen. And it gets more serious than that. This year, for the first time, scientists have said something that they have never been able to say before with this kind of confidence. They believe that we are now living through the early stage of this system's pre-collapse warning signal, not the collapse itself. Let me be very careful and very honest about that, because this is the part that careless coverage gets wrong. Nobody is telling you the current has shut down, and nobody is telling you the exact year it will. What they are telling you is something subtler and in its own way more chilling. For the first time, they have found a way to read the warning lights on the dashboard, and the warning lights are on. And I want to set the right tone for this one before we go any further, because this is a topic that gets pulled hard in two unhelpful directions. On one side, there is a kind of breathless doom, headlines screaming that the current has already stopped and the ice age is next week, which is simply not true and which, ironically, makes it easier for people to tune the whole thing out as hype. On the other side, there is a kind of smooth dismissal, the sense that this is just one more far-off climate worry to file away and forget, which is also wrong, and arguably more dangerous. The truth sits in the uncomfortable middle, and the uncomfortable middle is exactly where I want to live for the next while. The truth is that this is a real, measurable, well-understood physical system, that it is genuinely weakening, that there is genuine new science telling us something genuinely new about how close the danger might be, and that there is also genuine, honest uncertainty about the timing that no responsible person should paper over. I am going to try very hard to give you all of that, the alarm and the caveats together, because you cannot actually understand this story with either one missing. This is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. That is a mouthful, so for the rest of this video I am going to call it by the name scientists use, the AMOC. And I want to do something with you over the next stretch of time. I want to take this thing apart and understand it properly. I want to look at what it actually is, because once you see how it works, you will never look at a map of Europe the same way again. I want to look at why it is so fragile, because the source of its strength turns out to be the exact same thing that makes it vulnerable. I want to walk through the brand new research that finally lets us measure how close we are to losing it, because that research is genuinely one of the most quietly remarkable things I have read this year. And I want to be straight with you the whole way through about what we actually know, what we are guessing, and where the honest scientists disagree, because this is a topic that attracts a lot of noise, and you deserve the signal. Before we go any further, I want you to hold one image in your mind, because we're going to come back to it again and again. Picture the warm water leaving the tropics, sliding up the coast of America, crossing the Atlantic, and giving up its heat to the cold northern air. Picture that heat keeping a continent alive, and now picture the machine that drives all of it slowing down, year by year, in a way so gradual that for decades nobody could even agree it was happening. That slow, quiet weakening is the spine of this entire story. Everything else hangs off it. Because here is the thing about systems like this, and I want to plant this idea early so it is sitting in the back of your mind the whole time. A feedback loop that holds itself together is stable, right up until the moment it isn't. It does not weaken in a straight, polite line that gives you plenty of warning. It can absorb a shove, and absorb another, and absorb another, looking for all the world like nothing is wrong, and then cross a single invisible threshold and come apart faster than anyone watching would have believed possible. We have a name for that threshold. We call it a tipping point. And the whole terrifying question at the heart of this video is a simple one. How close is the amok to its own? For a very long time, the honest answer to that question was a shrug. We knew the current was weakening. We could feel in the data that something was draining out of the system. But weakening and collapsing are not the same thing, and we had no real way to tell how much road was left between the two. We were a passenger in a car watching the speed slowly drop, with no idea whether the tank was nearly full or nearly empty. That is what changed this year. Somebody finally built the fuel gauge, and when they held it up against 30 years of real-world data, against information we had been collecting the entire time without fully understanding what it was telling us, the needle was not sitting reassuringly near full. To understand why that matters, and to understand why a 53-kilometre shift in the position of a current most people have never heard of should hold your attention for the next hour and a half, we have to start at the beginning. We have to follow the water. Because to understand how something this enormous could fall apart, you first have to understand the almost unbelievable elegance of how it holds itself together in the first place. And that begins in the warm, shallow, sunlit water of the Gulf of Mexico. Part 2. The river with no banks. The whole thing starts somewhere warm. Picture the Gulf of Mexico, that great bathtub of water tucked into the underside of North America, where the surface sits at around 27 degrees Celsius. That is bath warm. That is the temperature of water you would happily swim in without flinching. Sunlight has been pouring into the tropics for as long as there has been a tropics, and this shallow tropical water is where the sun stores a fraction of that energy, locking it away in the simple warmth of the sea. Now, water that warm wants to move, and the wind gives it a push. Steady wind stress dragging across the surface of the ocean drives this warm water northward. It funnels through the Straits of Florida, that narrow gap between the Florida coast and the islands of the Caribbean, and once it clears that bottleneck it runs up the eastern seaboard of the United States, past Georgia, past the Carolinas, moving at something like 2 to 4 miles per hour. That might not sound fast. Walking pace, more or less. But you have to understand the sheer quantity of water we're talking about, because this is not a stream you could wade across. This is a river with no banks, a river made of nothing but the difference between warm water and cold. By the time this flow reaches the open Atlantic, it has more than doubled in size, and it is moving something on the order of 80 million cubic meters of water every single second. Let me try to make that number mean something, because it is so large it just slides off the brain. Every river on Earth, all of them combined, every great waterway you have ever heard of, the Amazon and the Congo and the Mississippi and the Nile and the Yangtze and the 10,000 rivers you have never heard of, every drop of moving fresh water on the entire planet added together, does not come close to what this single current carries. It is moving dozens of times the flow of all the world's rivers at once, in a band of water about 150 kilometers wide. This is the Gulf Stream, and most people, when they hear that name, picture more or less the whole thing. A warm current that crosses the Atlantic and keeps Europe cozy. End of story. But that is not the end of the story. That is barely the beginning of it, because the Gulf Stream that you can see, the warm surface flow that shows up bright red on the ocean temperature maps, is only the top layer of something far larger. It is the lid on a machine that runs the full depth of the ocean and reaches all the way around the planet. The warm surface current is the part we named, because it is the part early sailors could feel under their hulls. But underneath it, and connected to it, is a circulation so vast that it links the North Atlantic to the seas around Antarctica and ties the surface of the ocean to its blackest, coldest depths. The Gulf Stream is the visible handle, the amok is the whole machine, so follow the warm water as it travels north and east across the Atlantic, because this is where the magic happens, And it is so simple that it is almost disappointing until you sit with it. As the water moves, it is in constant contact with the air above it, and that air, especially as you go further north, is colder than the water. So the water does the most natural thing in the world. It gives up its heat. It bleeds warmth into the atmosphere, hour after hour, mile after mile, all the way across the ocean. Think of it as a sort of planetary underfloor heating. The ocean has carried a slab of tropical warmth thousands of miles from where the sun put it, and now it is releasing that warmth into the air directly upwind of an entire continent. The prevailing winds pick up that warmed air and carry it onto the land, and that is the secret. That is why London is not Siberia. The heat that should belong to the Gulf of Mexico gets delivered by ocean and then by wind to the doorstep of Europe. I want you to really feel the scale of the energy involved here, because the numbers are genuinely difficult to hold in your head. This system, the full overturning circulation, moves roughly 1 petawatt of thermal energy. A petawatt is 1,000 trillion watts. If that means nothing to you, here is the comparison that finally made it land for me. It is about 50 times the total energy consumption of all human civilization. Everything we burn, everything we generate, every power plant and engine and furnace and device on the entire planet, all of it running at once, adds up to roughly 1/50th of what this ocean current moves as a matter of routine every second with no machinery and no fuel and no operator. It just does it. It has been doing it on this scale since long before there were humans around to be kept warm by it. And I think it is worth being honest about why a number like 1 petawatt is so hard to take seriously, even when you know it is true. Our intuitions about energy are built around things we can touch: a hot stove, a car engine, a bolt of lightning. We have no instinct at all for the scale of a planetary current, because nothing in ordinary life prepares us for it. So when a scientist says this system moves 50 times the energy of all human civilization, the words go in, but the meaning bounces off. It is too big to feel. And that, in a small way, is the whole problem with this story in a single sentence. The thing is so vast that we cannot quite believe it is fragile, and so quiet that we cannot quite believe it is in trouble. The scale that ought to make us pay attention is the very thing that lulls us into assuming it will always be fine. Bigness reads, to the human gut, as permanence. It is a bias, and it is a dangerous one, and we're going to watch it lead us astray again and again before this video is done. It is worth slowing down on what that heat delivery actually feels like on the receiving end, because it is easy to say the words tropical heat and move on without feeling the size of the gift. The warmth that crosses the Atlantic and bleeds into the air over Europe is not a gentle seasonal nudge. It is the difference between a habitable maritime climate and a continental deep freeze. The same latitude that gives Canada its frozen Atlantic provinces gives Britain its mild green winters, and the only thing standing between those two fates is this delivery of borrowed warmth. Coastal Norway stays ice-free through the winter, its ports open, its fishing fleets working, at a latitude where the other side of the world is locked solid. Whole economies, whole patterns of where people chose to settle and farm and build over thousands of years, quietly assume this heat will keep arriving. It is infrastructure that nobody built and nobody maintains, and almost nobody knows is there. And the mechanism of the delivery matters too, because it explains why the whole thing is so vulnerable to a problem at one specific spot. The heat does not radiate outward in all directions like a stove. It is carried physically by moving water along a route like a conveyor belt carrying hot bricks from a kiln to a cold room. As long as the belt keeps moving, the room stays warm. But a conveyor belt has a motor, a single place where the work of driving the whole thing actually gets done. Slow that motor, and it does not matter how much heat is waiting back at the kiln. The bricks stop arriving. We're going to find in a little while that this entire planetary conveyor has exactly such a motor, in exactly one vulnerable place, and that the motor is precisely what is now beginning to falter. And the strangest, most beautiful part of the whole thing is how patient it is. A single parcel of water, one imaginary drop dropped into this system at the surface of the tropical Atlantic, would take something like 1,000 years to complete the full circuit. 1,000 years. A drop of water that began this journey when Europe was a patchwork of medieval kingdoms would only now be finishing its loop. This is a machine that runs on a timescale longer than nations, longer than languages, longer than almost anything we build or remember. It moves at the speed of geology, And that right there is exactly why this story is so unsettling, and it is the thread I want you to keep hold of for the rest of this video. When you have a system this enormous, this powerful, this slow, you instinctively assume it must also be stable. Surely something that takes 1,000 years to turn over once, something that shrugs off the energy of 50 human civilizations, must be effectively permanent on any timescale that matters to us. Surely it would take something cataclysmic, something on the scale of the force that drives it to disturb it. That assumption is the trap. Because the same things that make this current so mighty are the things that make it precariously balanced. Its power does not come from brute force. It comes from a delicate, self-reinforcing loop, a loop that keeps itself going by feeding on its own motion. And a loop like that has a hidden property that we're going to spend a lot of this video unpacking. It is stable until it isn't. It will hold and hold and hold, looking utterly unbreakable, and then it will reach a line you cannot see from the outside, and on the far side of that line it does not gently wind down. It breaks. To understand how a machine this vast could possibly break, we have to understand exactly what is holding it together in the first place. We have followed the warm water north and watched it give away its heat. But giving away that heat is not the end of the journey for that water. It is the trigger for the most important event in the entire system, the single physical act on which the whole circulation depends. The water has to sink. And to understand why it sinks, and why that sinking is now in trouble, we have to talk about the two invisible properties that decide whether a body of water rises or falls. We have to talk about temperature, and we have to talk about salt. Part 3. The engine in the dark. Everything about this current, its strength, its reach, its 1,000-year patience, comes down to a single physical event happening in the cold seas of the far North Atlantic. The water has to sink, not drift, not flow sideways, but plunge downward, off the surface and into the deep ocean, kilometers straight down into the dark. That sinking is the engine. It is the part of the machine that actually does the work. And to understand why it is now in danger, you have to understand the only two things in the entire ocean that decide whether water sinks or floats. The first is temperature. This one is intuitive once you see it. Warm water is less dense than cold water. When you heat water, you are pumping energy into its molecules, and they respond by vibrating faster and harder, jostling their neighbours and pushing them apart. The whole body of water swells slightly, takes up a little more space, and so the same amount of water weighs a little less for its volume. It becomes lighter, and lighter things float. Now cool that water down, and the opposite happens. The vibration slows. The molecules stop shoving each other away and settle closer together. The water contracts, packs tighter, and grows heavier for every litre of it. And heavy water sinks. So all else being equal, cold water wants to drop and warm water wants to rise. That is half the engine. There is a small wrinkle worth mentioning, because it shows just how finely tuned this all is. Water is strange stuff. Unlike almost everything else, it does not simply keep getting denser the colder it gets all the way down. Fresh water actually reaches its maximum density a few degrees above freezing, which is why ice floats, and why lakes freeze from the top down rather than the bottom up. Salt water behaves differently, and these quirks of how cold water and salty water interact are not trivia. They are part of what decides exactly where, and exactly how violently, the sinking happens in the North Atlantic. The whole engine sits in a narrow window of temperature and salinity, where everything lines up just right for surface water to become dense enough to plunge. Nudge the conditions outside that window, even a little, and the sinking weakens. The system is not running with a huge comfortable margin. It is running in a fairly narrow band, which is exactly why a steady trickle of fresh water in the wrong place can matter so much. The second factor is salt, and this one is just as simple. Salt water is denser than fresh water, for the most obvious reason imaginable. Salt water has actual salt dissolved in it, ions of sodium and chloride physically packed in among the water molecules. They add weight without adding much volume. The same litre of water simply weighs more once you have stirred salt into it, so saltier water is heavier water, and heavier water sinks. That is the other half of the engine. Cold makes water sink, salt makes water sink, and in the far North Atlantic the current arranges for both of those things to happen to the same water at the same time, which is why the sinking there is so powerful. Walk through it with me, because it is genuinely elegant. The warm, salty water of the Gulf Stream travels north, giving up its heat to the air the whole way. As it gives up heat, it cools, and cooling makes it denser. At the same time, all that exposure to the cold, dry northern air drives evaporation, and when water evaporates it leaves its salt behind, so the water that remains gets saltier, which also makes it denser. Cold and salty, the two heaviest conditions water can be in, stacking onto the same parcel of water at the same time. By the time this water reaches the seas off Greenland, Iceland and Norway, it has become so cold and so dense that it can no longer hold its place at the surface. It loses its argument with gravity, and it sinks. This is the moment the whole system turns on. Scientists call it deep water formation, which is a wonderfully plain name for something so dramatic. Out in the open ocean, across enormous regions of the high North Atlantic, surface water is quietly plunging into the abyss, column after column of it, descending into the deep ocean where the sunlight has never reached. And once it is down there, it does not just sit. It begins to flow, slowly, southward, hugging the seafloor, a vast cold river running along the bottom of the Atlantic in the opposite direction, to the warm flow at the surface above it. This deep return flow is nothing like the brisk Gulf Stream. It moves at a crawl, just a few centimetres per second, a pace so slow you would never perceive it. But it is relentless, and it is colossal, a sheet of cold, dense water creeping along the ocean floor all the way toward Antarctica. And here is something I find genuinely haunting. Above that deep cold river, sometimes directly above it, the warm surface current is running the other way. The same patch of ocean can have tropical heat racing north near the surface, and frigid darkness oozing south near the bottom. Two opposite rivers stacked on top of each other, part of the same single loop. That is the overturning in the overturning circulation. The water turns over, top to bottom, and then crawls home along the floor of the world. I want to dwell for a moment on the sheer physical drama of that sinking, because it is one of the most extraordinary processes on Earth, and almost nobody ever pictures it. We are not talking about a gentle, even settling of water across the whole ocean. In the right conditions, in the cold seas of the far north in the depth of winter, the sinking happens in violent concentrated bursts called convective chimneys. Picture columns of surface water, sometimes kilometres wide, suddenly losing their stability and plunging downward together, thousands of metres straight down into the dark in a matter of days. It is the ocean turning itself inside out. For a brief ferocious window each winter, the surface of the sea pours itself into the abyss, and that plunging is the heartbeat of the entire global circulation. Miss enough of those winters, weaken enough of those chimneys, and the heartbeat falters. And notice how precariously the whole thing is balanced on conditions at one small set of locations. The sun pours energy into a vast tropical ocean thousands of kilometres wide, but the return stroke, the sinking that actually drives the loop, happens in just a few specific regions of the high North Atlantic, places small enough that you could circle them on a globe with a fingertip. The strength of a circulation that touches every ocean on the planet, that warms a continent and feeds the deep sea, comes down to whether the water in those few small patches is cold enough and salty enough to fall. It is an absurd concentration of importance into a tiny area. It is as if the structural integrity of an entire cathedral rested on the soundness of a single brick, hidden somewhere down in the foundations, where the cold, fresh water is now seeping in. When this deep water finally reaches the Southern Ocean, the band of water that circles Antarctica, the loop gets its second push. Around Antarctica there is nothing to stop the wind. It races all the way around the continent without ever hitting land, building into the strongest sustained winds anywhere on the planet, the westerlies of the Southern Ocean. Those winds drag the surface water northward, away from the continent, and as that surface water is hauled away, something has to rise up to replace it. So the deep water that has been crawling south for centuries gets drawn upward toward the surface in a process called upwelling. The cold, deep water rises, rejoins the surface, and is eventually pulled back into the great northward flow, and the whole circuit begins again. It is worth pausing to appreciate that this is not really one regional current at all, but the Atlantic's piece of a single circulation that touches every ocean on the planet. Scientists sometimes call the whole global system the Great Ocean Conveyor, and the Amok is its beating Atlantic heart, the place where the most powerful sinking happens and where the loop is driven hardest. Water that sinks in the North Atlantic can spend centuries creeping along the bottom of the world, past the tip of Africa, into the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, slowly mixing and rising and beginning the long journey home. The whole thing is one connected body, and the Atlantic overturning is the part that does the most work to keep it all moving. Which means that when we talk about weakening the amok, we're not talking about disturbing one regional feature in isolation. We're talking about putting a brake on the master wheel of the entire global ocean, the single most important place where the whole planetary conveyor gets its push. Damage the heart, and you do not just hurt the heart. You weaken everything the heart was keeping alive. Now step back and look at what you have. Warm water rushes north and gives up its heat. Cooled and salted, it sinks. It crawls south along the bottom. Far away, around Antarctica, the wind pulls it back up to the surface. And then it heads north once more. Each stage sets up the next. The sinking in the north pulls more warm water up from the south to take its place. The pulling and the sinking reinforce each other. This is a self-reinforcing feedback loop, a machine that runs on its own motion, dragging the water behind it and pushing the water in front of it, keeping itself going century after century with no engine room and no one at the controls. It is, when you really look at it, one of the most elegant pieces of natural machinery on the planet. And I have to keep coming back to the same uncomfortable point, because the elegance is exactly the danger. A self-reinforcing loop is strong precisely because each part holds up the others, but that also means each part depends on the others. The whole structure is balanced on one keystone act, the sinking of dense water in the North Atlantic. As long as that water keeps sinking hard, the loop keeps turning and the heat keeps flowing to Europe. But the sinking depends entirely on the water being dense enough to drop, which depends on it being cold enough and salty enough at exactly the right place. Weaken that one step. Make the northern water just a little too fresh or a little too warm to sink the way it used to, and the keystone starts to crumble. The loop that holds itself together so beautifully would begin, just as efficiently, to come apart. So the real question, the question this entire video is circling, becomes very specific. Is anything happening right now that would make that northern water less able to sink? Is anything interfering with the one act on which the whole system depends? And the answer, unfortunately, is yes. There is something pouring into the exact part of the ocean where the sinking is supposed to happen. Something cold, something fresh, something that arrives in greater quantities every year. It is coming off the largest island on Earth, and it is doing the one thing this system cannot tolerate. It is making the water that is supposed to sink too light to fall. Part 4. The tap that won't turn off. Sitting just to the west of the place where the North Atlantic water is supposed to sink is the second largest mass of ice on the planet. The Greenland ice sheet is almost incomprehensibly big, a dome of frozen fresh water up to 3 kilometers thick, holding enough water to raise global sea levels by about 7 meters if it ever all melted. For most of human history, that ice just sat there, locked up, frozen solid, a great white reservoir doing nothing at all to the ocean around it. It was a closed tap, and it is worth understanding why the tap opened, because it closes the loop on the whole problem. The Greenland ice sheet has been melting faster and faster as the planet warms, and not only in the obvious way of ice melting in warmer air. Warmer summers carve rivers of meltwater across the surface of the ice and send them plunging down into its depths. Warmer oceans eat at the floating tongues of ice, where the great glaciers meet the sea, loosening them so they discharge their ice into the ocean faster. The whole island is shedding mass at a pace that has accelerated within the span of satellite observation, and every bit of that lost ice becomes fresh water entering the sea. So the very warming that is heating the planet is, through Greenland, loading the North Atlantic with the cold, fresh water that can choke the current. It is a strange and almost paradoxical chain. Global heat, funneled through a melting ice sheet, becomes a threat of regional cold. We will come back to that paradox near the end, because it is one of the reasons this danger is so easy for people to dismiss. That tap is now open. Greenland is losing ice faster than at any point in the modern record, hundreds of billions of tons of it every year, and every ton that melts becomes cold, fresh water running off the ice and pouring into the sea. And look at where it is pouring. It is draining straight into the North Atlantic, into the exact region where the entire global circulation depends on water being able to sink. Of all the places on Earth, you could choose to dump an enormous growing flood of cold, fresh water This is very nearly the worst one. It is like pouring water into the one cylinder of an engine that has to stay dry to fire. Now remember the two rules of density, because this is where they collide. The water arriving from the Gulf Stream is supposed to sink because it is cold and salty means heavy. But the meltwater pouring off Greenland is fresh, and fresh means light. So now you have two kinds of water competing in the very place where the sinking is meant to happen. The cold, salty water from the south is trying to get dense enough to drop, and the cold, fresh water from Greenland is diluting it, watering down its saltiness, stealing away the very thing that was supposed to make it heavy. The fresh water does not have to be warm to cause trouble, it just has to be fresh. By thinning out the salt, it erases part of the density difference that tells the water to sink in the first place, and here is the part of the feedback that should genuinely worry you, because it is where the loop can turn against itself. As the sinking weakens and the current slows, it carries less warm, salty tropical water north into the sinking region. Less salty water arriving means the north gets fresher still, not just from Greenland but from the slowing of the current itself, and fresher water sinks even less. So a weaker current makes the water fresher, and fresher water makes the current weaker, and round it goes. The very same self-reinforcing quality that built this system up and held it steady for thousands of years can, past a certain point, run in reverse and tear it down, each step of weakening feeding the next. A feedback loop does not care which direction it amplifies. It will just as faithfully accelerate a collapse as it once maintained a balance. That is the hidden teeth inside the elegance, and it is precisely why the failure, when it comes fast. And when you take away some of that density, you do not switch the sinking off like a light. You weaken it. The water still sinks, but it sinks with less conviction. It does not drop as fast, or it does not reach as deep, or both. And because that sinking is the engine of the entire circulation, a weaker sink means a weaker pull, which means the whole current slows down. The keystone is being quietly loosened, not yanked out, loosened a little more each year by a tap that nobody can turn off. Here is the part that I think is genuinely important to understand, because it is where false comfort and real danger live side by side. This system is robust. It is not a delicate thing that falls over at the first push. It can absorb a truly enormous amount of fresh water and respond with nothing more dramatic than a gradual, almost graceful slowing. You could pour in more and more meltwater, year after year, and for a long time the only thing you would see is the current easing off bit by bit, weakening in a smooth and undramatic line. If you only looked at that line, you might reassure yourself that the system is simply adjusting, finding a new and slower balance, handling the stress, and up to a point, that reassurance would be completely correct. But only up to a point, and that point has a name, and we are going to spend the rest of this video stalking it. It is called the tipping point. It is the threshold beyond which the gradual, manageable weakening stops being gradual and manageable, and the system flips. Beyond the tipping point, the same feedback loop that held everything together for thousands of years runs in reverse and tears it apart. The weakening accelerates, the sinking fails, the loop loses its grip on itself, and the circulation does not ease down to a gentle stop. It collapses, suddenly and almost entirely, and on a timescale that has nothing to do with the 1,000-year patience of the system in its healthy state. There is a useful way to picture how a tipping point actually works, and it is worth planting now because it will make everything that follows click into place. Imagine a shallow valley with a ball resting at the bottom. Give the ball a push and it rolls partway up the side and rolls back down again, settling in the middle. Push it harder and it climbs higher, but still it returns. That valley is the system in its stable state, and the ball returning to the bottom is the system absorbing stress and recovering. You could push that ball thousands of times and conclude reasonably that it always comes back. But now imagine that each push also, very slowly, wears down the far wall of the valley, lowering it bit by bit. For a long time, nothing seems to change. The ball still rolls up and rolls back, and then, on one push no harder than the 1,000 before it, the ball rolls up the lowered wall, crests the top, and rolls down the other side into a completely different valley. It does not come back. It has found a new resting place, a new stable state, and getting it back over the wall into the old valley is now extraordinarily hard. That is a tipping point. The fresh water from Greenland is both the push and the thing slowly wearing down the wall. And the cruel part, the part that makes this so hard for us to respond to, is that watching the ball roll up and roll back over and over gives you no reliable sense of how much wall is left. The last push before the ball goes over looks exactly like the first push that it shrugged off. There is no groan, no visible strain, no obvious final warning. The system that is one push from flipping behaves almost identically to the system that has centuries of margin to spare. Everything we will look at from here on, the model, the satellites, the 53-kilometre drift, is ultimately an attempt to answer one question that the ball itself can never tell you just by watching it roll. How much wall is left? I cannot stress enough how counterintuitive this is, because it cuts against everything our instincts tell us about big, slow things. We expect a giant, sluggish system to fail the way it lives slowly, giving us decades of obvious warning, a long, gentle slope we could see coming and step off of in time. That is not how tipping points work. A tipping point hides inside the smooth part of the curve. From the outside, right up until the final moment, a system approaching its tipping point and a system that is merely settling into a slower but stable state can look almost identical. The gradual weakening that should comfort you is the same gradual weakening that precedes the cliff. That is what makes this so hard. The warning and the false alarm wear the same face. So you might reasonably ask, how do we even know a true collapse is possible? How do we know the Amok has a cliff at the end of its slope and is not just one of those systems that weakens forever and never quite breaks? And the answer is the most sobering part of this whole section, because we know it is possible for the simplest reason there is. It has happened before. The Earth has run this exact experiment with this exact current, driven by this exact mechanism, a flood of fresh meltwater into the North Atlantic. We did not have to model it or guess at it. It is written into the planet's own records, in ice cores and ocean sediments, and the chemistry of ancient mud. And what those records show is that when this circulation was hit with a great pulse of meltwater near the end of the last ice age, it did not weaken politely and recover. It crashed, and when it crashed, it dragged an entire hemisphere into a cold that lasted more than 1,000 years. That event has a name. It is one of the most important and best studied abrupt climate shifts in the entire geologic record, and it is the closest thing we have to a dress rehearsal for what the new research is warning about. Before we look at the cutting-edge model that finally lets us measure how close we are today, I want to go back, roughly 12,900 years, to the last time the world watched this current fail. Because once you understand what happened during the Younger Dryas, the modern data stops looking like an abstraction. It starts looking like a memory. Part 5. The 1,000-Year Winter. Roughly 12,900 years ago, the world was finally climbing out of the last ice age. The great ice sheets that had buried much of the Northern Hemisphere were in retreat. Temperatures were rising. The long brutal cold was loosening its grip, and the planet was warming its way toward the mild, stable climate that would eventually let human civilization take root. If you had been alive then, watching the ice pull back year after year, you would have had every reason to believe the worst was over and the thaw was permanent. And then, very suddenly, the cold came back. In what was, by the standards of climate, the blink of an eye, the North Atlantic region snapped back toward near-glacial conditions. Not over millennia. Over a span that may have been as short as a few decades, and possibly faster, the warming reversed and the deep cold returned, especially around the North Atlantic and Europe. Forests that had begun to spread gave way again to tundra. The signature of the event shows up vividly in the pollen record, in a little Arctic wildflower called Dryas octopetala, a hardy, cold-loving plant that suddenly reappeared across landscapes that had been warming. That flower is where the event gets its name. We call it the Younger Dryas. And the cold it brought did not last a season or a decade. It held for something like 1,200 years. Now sit with the strangeness of that. The entire planet was on a warming trajectory, ice retreating, the long thaw underway, and right in the middle of that recovery the North Atlantic lurched violently back into the freezer and stayed there for over 1,000 years before finally warming again. Something reached into a warming world and slammed one region back into the ice age, hard and for a very long time. And we are not guessing about any of this from a single dusty clue. The Younger Dryas is one of the best documented abrupt climate events in the entire history of the Earth, written into the planet's records in a dozen different inks that all agree with each other. It is in the Greenland ice cores, where each annual layer of snow traps a tiny sample of the ancient atmosphere and a chemical fingerprint of the temperature when it fell, letting scientists read the climate year by year like tree rings made of ice. It is in the ocean's sediments, in the shells of tiny creatures that lived and died in particular temperatures. It is in lake beds, in cave formations, in the pollen of plants like that little Arctic flower spreading back across a refreezing land. When that many independent records, gathered by different methods on different continents, all tell the same story of a sudden plunge into cold and a long, slow climb back out, you're no longer looking at a theory. You're looking at something the Earth genuinely did, recorded so many times over that there is no serious doubt that it happened. For decades, the obvious question was simply, what could possibly do that? What kind of force can override a planet-wide warming and refreeze a hemisphere? And there is a human dimension to the Younger Dryas that I think gets lost when we treat it purely as a line on a graph. People lived through it. There were human communities scattered across the Northern Hemisphere when the cold came back. And for them this was not a data point. It was the world they knew turning hostile within a span of time short enough to be felt. The animals they hunted shifted or vanished. The plants they gathered failed. The patterns their parents and grandparents had taught them, the reliable rhythms of where the food was and when the warmth came, stopped being reliable. Some archaeologists think this very upheaval, the pressure of a suddenly colder and less predictable world, helped push human societies in entirely new directions in the long aftermath. The point is that an amok collapse is not an abstraction even at the human scale. The last time it happened, our own ancestors were there to feel the cold arrive and they had to remake their lives around it. We would be no different except that there are now 8 billion of us, arranged in a global civilization far less able to simply pick up and move than a scattering of hunter-gatherers ever was. The leading answer, the one that fits the evidence best, should sound deeply familiar by now, because it is the exact mechanism we spent the last 2 parts building. As the ice sheets melted at the end of the Ice Age, they did not just trickle away. Enormous volumes of meltwater pooled at their edges, held back behind walls of remaining ice like water behind a dam. The largest of these was a vast lake sitting over what is now Canada, a body of water so big it makes the modern Great Lakes look like puddles. And at some point the ice dam holding it back gave way. A staggering flood of cold, fresh water was released, and it poured into the North Atlantic. You already know exactly what that does. We just spent 2 parts on it. A massive influx of cold, fresh water into the North Atlantic dilutes the salt, kills the density, and chokes off the sinking that drives the entire circulation. The freshwater pulse from the melting ice sheets did to the ancient amok precisely what the Greenland meltwater is beginning to do to the modern one. It loosened the keystone, except back then it did not just loosen it. It pulled it clean out. The circulation slowed dramatically or shut down. The great conveyor of tropical heat to the north faltered, and without that heat delivery, the North Atlantic and Europe plunged back into cold. The current failed, and a hemisphere paid for it for more than a millennium. And the Younger Dryas was not some quiet, gentle dip that only shows up to specialists squinting at graphs. It was a violent, fully realized version of exactly the world we sketched out as the worst case. The North Atlantic and Europe went brutally cold. Ice and snow returned to landscapes that had been greening. The reach of the event extended far beyond the Atlantic, because just as we discussed, this current is wired into the circulation of the whole planet. The tropical rain belts shifted. Monsoon systems faltered. Evidence of drought and disruption shows up in records thousands of kilometers from the North Atlantic, in Asia, in the Americas, in the chemistry of cave formations and lake beds that recorded the rains that did and did not fall. One current failing in the North Atlantic reorganized the climate of much of the planet, and it did so for over 1,000 years. This is not a thought experiment. It is the most recent time the Earth actually ran this exact failure, and it left scars on every continent. And here is a detail that should make the hair stand up a little, given everything we have said about how these systems do not fail gently. The transition into the Younger Dryas, the plunge from a warming world back into deep cold, appears in some records to have happened astonishingly fast. Not over centuries. In places, the ice core evidence suggests the climate flipped over a span that may have been as short as a few decades, possibly even faster in some respects. A human community living through it could have watched the climate of their world transform within a single lifetime. That is the real lesson of the younger Dryas, and it is the same lesson the new model will hand us in a moment. When this system goes, it does not necessarily give you generations to adjust. The historical record and the cutting-edge simulation are telling the same story from opposite ends of time. The change, when it finally comes, can be shockingly abrupt. This is the single most important precedent we have, and I want to be careful about what it does and does not prove, because this is exactly the kind of place where careless storytelling goes wrong. The younger Dryas does not prove that the Amok is about to collapse tomorrow. The conditions then were not identical to the conditions now. The world was coming out of an ice age, with far more ice available to melt and dump into the ocean all at once, and the geography was different. So no, this is not a perfect one-to-one map onto our situation, and anyone who tells you it is overselling it. But here is what it absolutely does prove, and what makes it indispensable. It proves that the cliff is real. It proves that this is not a system that can only ever weaken gently and recover. It proves that the Amok has, in the actual history of this planet, been pushed past its tipping point by a flood of fresh water into the North Atlantic, and that when it went past that point it did not ease down, it collapsed, and the consequences were severe, regional, and astonishingly long-lasting. The tipping point we talked about in the last part is not a theoretical feature of a model. It is a thing that has happened. The Earth has shown us the failure mode of this exact machine, driven by this exact cause. The younger Dryas is the planet's own warning label, written into the ice and the mud, telling us in plain terms that this current can break, and that when it breaks hard. And that is where the precedent stops being history and starts being the spine of this whole story again. Because if the cliff is real, if we know for a fact that a freshwater flood into the North Atlantic can drive this circulation past the point of no return, then the only questions left are the urgent ones. How fast is the modern freshwater tap running? How much weakening can the current take before it reaches its own edge? And most of all, the question that has haunted this field for decades, the one we genuinely could not answer until very recently. How would we even know if we were getting close? How do you spot the approach to a cliff that hides inside the smooth part of the curve when a system sliding toward collapse looks, from the outside, almost exactly like a system that is merely slowing down? For a long time, the honest answer to that question was that we couldn't. We could see that the current was weakening. We had a precedent telling us it could fall off a cliff, but we had no way to measure how much road was left. We were driving toward a drop we knew was out there somewhere, in the dark, with no map and no headlights, watching the speed slowly bleed away, and unable to tell whether we had 100 miles to go or 10. That is the problem a team of researchers finally cracked this year. They found a way to turn the headlights on. And to understand what they did, you first have to understand why measuring the strength of this current, which we have actually been doing for years, was never going to be enough. Part 6. The speedometer and the fuel gauge. For decades, when scientists were asked the only question that really matters, how close are we to the tipping point, the honest answer was a kind of uncomfortable shrug. Not because they were not trying, and not because they did not care, but because the tools we had were answering a different question than the one we most needed answered. We are not flying blind on the basic facts. Since the year 2004, there has been an extraordinary piece of scientific infrastructure stretched across the Atlantic Ocean at 26 degrees north, roughly the latitude of the Bahamas and the Canary Islands. It is called the Rapid Array, and it is exactly what it sounds like, a line of instruments, moorings anchored to the seafloor and rising up through the water column, strung all the way across the ocean from the American side to the African side. These moorings sit in the water year-round, measuring temperature, salinity, pressure, and the movement of the water at every depth. And from all of that data, scientists can calculate how much water the Amok is actually moving. For more than 20 years now, this array has been taking the pulse of the current, continuously, across an entire ocean. It is one of the great underappreciated achievements of modern oceanography. So we can measure the strength of the Amok directly. We know roughly how much water it is carrying, and we can watch that number change over time, and that should be exactly what we want, right? If we can measure the strength, surely we can tell how close it is to failing. Here is the problem, and it is subtle, but it is everything. Strength alone does not tell you proximity to collapse. Knowing how strong the current is right now is not the same as knowing how close it is to its tipping point. And the reason is the trap we have already run into twice in this video. A current can be weakening. even weakening steadily, and still be nowhere near its threshold. Or it could be a hair away from the edge. The raw strength does not distinguish between those two situations, because the approach to a tipping point hides inside that smooth, gradual weakening. A system gently settling toward a new stable balance, and a system sliding toward a cliff, can show you the very same slowly declining number. The speedometer tells you how fast you're going. It does not tell you how much road is left before the drop, and it is worth being clear that this is not a knock on the rapid array, or the people who built it. That array is one of the genuine triumphs of modern science, a line of instruments holding station across an entire ocean for more than 20 years, feeding us a continuous record of one of the planet's master systems. Before it existed, we were largely guessing about the current strength from scattered snapshots. After it, we could finally watch the AMOC breathe. The limitation we are talking about is not a flaw in the array. It is a limitation in the very concept of measuring strength as a way of judging nearness to collapse. You could build 10 more arrays, measure the current strength 10 times more precisely, and you still would not have answered the question of how close the tipping point is, because strength and proximity are simply different quantities. It is not that our instrument was bad. It is that we were asking it to tell us something it fundamentally cannot. That is the analogy I keep coming back to, and I think it is the cleanest way to understand the whole problem. For 20 years we have had a superb speedometer. We could watch the current slow down. We could see, in the rapid data and in longer reconstructions stretching back centuries, that the AMOC was weakening, that it was running slower than it used to, that something was draining out of it. And those reconstructions are how we get that haunting headline from the very start of this video, the estimate that the current is now at its weakest in roughly 16 centuries. That number comes from piecing together indirect records, the temperature fingerprints the current leaves in the ocean, the patterns it presses into the sediment, and using them to reconstruct its strength back across more than 1,000 years. And the reconstruction says we are at a low not seen since before the modern world existed. But a speedometer reading at a record low still does not tell you the one thing you most want to know. It tells you that you're going slower than you have in 1,600 years. It does not tell you whether the cliff is 100 miles ahead or just around the next bend. For that, you do not need a better speedometer. You need a completely different instrument. You need a fuel gauge. You need something that does not just measure how the system is doing right now, but measures how much margin it has left before it tips. And for the entire history of this field, we did not have one. That is not a small gap. That is the gap. It is the difference between knowing you are losing something and knowing how long you have to act. Let me push the car analogy one more step because it captures the whole frustration of the last 20 years so well. Imagine you are a passenger in a car at night and you can see the speedometer, but the windshield is painted black. You can tell the car is slowing down. The needle has been dropping gently for a long time, but you cannot see the road. You do not know if there is a clear straight highway ahead with miles to spare, or a cliff edge 50 feet in front of the bumper. The speed alone, even watched carefully for years, cannot tell you which. You could be slowing down because the road is long and flat and safe, or you could be slowing down because some part of the machine is already failing in a way that ends with you going over the edge. Same needle, same gentle decline, completely different fates. That is the exact position oceanography was in. 2 decades of an excellent speedometer and a painted-over windshield. And the stakes of that blindness are not academic, because the entire value of a warning is in its timing. A warning that arrives the day the system collapses is not a warning at all. It is an obituary. The whole point of wanting a fuel gauge instead of just a speedometer is that a fuel gauge gives you the one thing that actually allows a response, which is lead time. If you can tell, while there is still road left, that the tank is running low, you can do something. If all you can do is watch the speed bleed away with no idea how much margin remains, then you find out you have run out at the precise moment it is too late to matter. For a slow threat, the gap between knowing it is happening and knowing how close it is can be the entire difference between a problem and a catastrophe. Which is why what these researchers did next is so genuinely important, and why it is worth understanding properly rather than just nodding at. And this is the part of the story where I genuinely sat back when I first read it, because the breakthrough did not come from launching some expensive new satellite, or building some new array across the ocean. It came from noticing something that had, in a sense, been sitting in plain sight in the scientific literature for years, an observation about how the ocean works that nobody had quite connected to the question of collapse in the right way. A team of researchers at Utrecht University in the Netherlands looked at a known feature of the system, a quiet structural detail about how the Gulf Stream stays where it is, and realised that it might be the fuel gauge we'd been missing all along. And I love this part of the story for a reason that goes beyond the amok, because it is such a perfect example of how real scientific breakthroughs often happen. We tend to imagine discovery as a sudden flash, a brand new observation, a never-before-seen piece of data. But just as often, the breakthrough is a new way of looking at something everyone already knew. The fact that the Gulf Stream's position is anchored by the deep current was not a secret. It was sitting there in the literature, an understood piece of physics, the kind of thing that turns up in textbooks and specialist papers. What had not happened was for someone to look at that quiet, settled fact and realise it could be repurposed as a gauge for the one thing we most desperately wanted to measure and could not. The data we needed was a step removed from the thing itself, and the genius was in seeing the connection between them, in realising that to measure the invisible deep ocean, you could instead watch where a famous surface current chose to sit. The pieces were all on the table. Someone finally arranged them into an answer. The insight is beautiful in its simplicity, and I want to make sure you really get it, because the entire payoff of this video rests on it. We have been treating the Gulf Stream as the thing being driven, the visible surface flow pushed along by the larger circulation. But the Gulf Stream also has a position, a particular path it follows, a place where it peels away from the American coast and heads out into the open Atlantic. And it turns out that position is not random, and it is not held in place only by the winds at the surface. It is anchored from below by the deep current we talked about, the cold return flow crawling south along the seafloor. That deep current, passing beneath the point where the Gulf Stream leaves the coast, exerts a kind of grip on it, a rotational force that pins the Gulf Stream's path in place and keeps it where it has been for as long as we have watched it. Now follow the logic, because this is the whole trick. That deep current is part of the overturning circulation. It is driven by the same sinking in the same northern seas that drives everything else. So if the amok weakens, the deep current weakens with it. And if the deep current weakens, its grip on the Gulf Stream loosens. And if that grip loosens, the Gulf Stream is no longer pinned as firmly in place, and it should begin to drift. Specifically, it should begin to drift northward. The position of the Gulf Stream, in other words, is secretly tied to the health of the entire deep circulation. Watch where the Gulf Stream sits, and you are indirectly watching the strength of the very thing we could never properly measure. The position is the fuel gauge. There was just one enormous problem standing in the way of actually using this insight, and it is the reason nobody had been able to do it before. To watch this effect, to see the Gulf Stream get nudged northward as the deep current weakens, you need a model of the ocean detailed enough to put the Gulf Stream exactly where it really is and track tiny shifts in its position. And almost every climate model we have is, for this particular job, hopelessly blurry. To understand why, and to understand the genuinely staggering effort it took to fix that, we need to talk about what it actually takes to simulate an ocean, and about a machine in the Netherlands that spent 6 months doing a calculation that would take your laptop 14 million years. Part 7. The machine built to watch it die. To simulate an ocean inside a computer, you cannot model every drop of water. There is far too much of it, so instead you chop the ocean up into a grid, a 3-dimensional mesh of boxes, and you calculate what the water is doing inside each box, and how each box exchanges heat and salt and momentum with its neighbours. The finer you make that grid, the smaller the boxes, the more faithfully your simulated ocean behaves like the real one. And the coarser the grid, the more detail you smear away. It is exactly like pixels in an image. A handful of giant pixels gives you a vague blur. Millions of tiny pixels give you a sharp photograph. Most of the climate models we rely on, the ones that underpin a great deal of what we know about the future, use ocean grid boxes that are roughly 100 kilometers across. 100 kilometers. That is a box bigger than many countries are wide. And at that resolution, something crucial gets lost. The Gulf Stream is a relatively narrow, sharp feature. Its exact path, the precise place where it leaves the coast and turns out to sea, simply cannot be captured by boxes 100 kilometers wide. The model smears the Gulf Stream into a broad, fuzzy, misplaced smudge, and if your model cannot even put the Gulf Stream in the right place, then it certainly cannot watch the Gulf Stream drift a few dozen kilometers as the deep current weakens. The very signal we wanted to study was being blurred out of existence by the coarseness of our own tools. That is why nobody had been able to use the fuel gauge insight before. We had the idea. We did not have a sharp enough picture to test it. So the researchers at Utrecht, Van Westen and Dijkstra decided to build a sharp enough picture. Instead of 100-kilometer boxes, they built a model with grid boxes just 10 kilometers across, 10 times finer in each horizontal direction. Fine enough at last for the simulated Gulf Stream to sit where the real Gulf Stream actually sits, and to move the way the real one would move. On paper that sounds like a modest upgrade, 10 kilometers instead of 100. In practice it is a monster, and the reason why tells you a lot about why this work had never been done. When you make the grid 10 times finer in each direction, you do not make the problem 10 times harder, you make it explode. You have far more boxes to calculate in every direction, and on top of that, a finer grid forces you to take smaller steps forward in time to keep the simulation stable, so you need many more time steps as well. It all multiplies together. The end result is that this high-resolution model is something like 1,000 times more expensive to run than a standard one. Not 10 times, 1,000 times. And that single fact is the slightly deflating, very human reason this work had simply never been done before. It was not that nobody had the idea. It was that the idea cost a fortune in computing time, and computing time is money, and somebody has to decide it is worth spending. Let me try to make the scale of that cost real. If you tried to run this simulation on a normal laptop, the kind of machine you might be watching this on right now, you would be waiting around 14 million years for it to finish. 14 million years. Your laptop would crumble to dust, the species that built it would come and go, and the calculation would still be grinding along. This is not a problem you solve by being patient. It is a problem you solve by getting access to one of the most powerful machines on the continent. The team used the Dutch national supercomputer, which carries the slightly whimsical name Snellius, a machine capable of around 14 quadrillion calculations every second, 14,000 trillion operations a second, and even Snellius, running flat out, took about 6 months to complete the simulation. 6 months of one of Europe's great supercomputers, doing nothing but modelling the slow death of an ocean current. There is something almost funny and a little bleak about the fact that the hardest part of warning humanity about this may simply have been convincing someone to pay for the electricity. We do not, as a species, love funding climate research. This calculation needed paying for anyway. It got done. There is something I find quietly profound about the size of that effort, and it is worth sitting with before we get to the result. 6 months of one of the most powerful computers on an entire continent, 14 quadrillion calculations every second, running day and night without pause, and the entire purpose of all that staggering effort was to do one thing: to watch, in faithful detail, how a single ocean current might die. Humanity built a machine that can perform more arithmetic in 1 second than every person who has ever lived could do in many lifetimes, and we pointed it at this question because the question matters that much, and because the only honest way to answer it was to simulate the ocean at a level of detail we had never been able to afford before. When you put it that way, the fact that it nearly did not happen, that it came down to whether the computing time was worth funding, is a small, sharp illustration of the very human problem we're going to end this whole video on. The hardest part of seeing the threat clearly was not the science. It was deciding the science was worth paying for. And there is a deeper point hiding in the resolution problem, one that should make you a little uneasy about how much we think we know. For years, our best models told us the AMOC was relatively stable, that a collapse this century was unlikely, and part of the reason they said that may simply be that they were too blurry to see the danger. A model with 100-kilometer boxes cannot resolve the sharp features and the tight feedbacks where the instability actually lives, so it tends to produce a smoother, calmer, more stable-looking ocean than the real one. In other words, some of our reassurance may have been an artifact of our own low resolution. When you finally sharpen the picture, the system looks more fragile, not less. That is a deeply uncomfortable thought, because it means the comfort we took from the older models may have been, in part, a kind of blur. and it raises the obvious question of what else our course tools have been smoothing into false calm, and once it was running, the team did something conceptually simple. They turned on the tap. They began introducing fresh water into the North Atlantic at a slowly increasing rate, mimicking the accelerating melt of Greenland, and then they did the patient, almost eerie work of just watching what happened to their high-resolution simulated ocean as the years and the centuries rolled by. They watched the Gulf Stream, they watched the deep current, they watched the overturning, and what unfolded happened in two stages that were strikingly, unsettlingly distinct. In the first stage, over roughly 400 simulated years, the Gulf Stream drifted gradually northward, slowly, gently. Over those 4 centuries it moved a total of about 133 kilometres north of where it began. That is a real, measurable shift, but spread across 400 years it is the kind of thing you would never notice from the inside, the kind of creep you could live your whole life inside of and never feel. This first stage is the pre-collapse signal. It is the period in which the amok is genuinely weakening, the deep current is loosening its grip, and the Gulf Stream is being nudged slowly north, but the system as a whole is still in its roughly stable state, still holding, still recoverable in principle, just quietly drifting toward the edge. And then came the second stage. The team ran the simulation forward just a little further, and over the course of only about 2 more simulated years, the Gulf Stream lurched northward by about 219 kilometres. Read those 2 numbers next to each other again, because the whole horror of this is in the comparison. In stage 1, the Gulf Stream moved about 133 kilometres, and it took 400 years. In stage 2, it moved about 219 kilometres, and it took 2 years. More movement in roughly 200 times less time. That is the tipping point, captured in a model for the first time at this resolution. At that moment, the deep circulation has changed so rapidly and so completely that it loses its ability to pin the Gulf Stream in place at all. The grip fails, the anchor lets go, and as it does, the amok disintegrates. And I want to make sure the 2-stage shape does not slip past as just a pair of numbers, because the shape itself is the entire warning. Most of us, when we imagine a system breaking down, picture a steady decline, a slope that gets worse at a roughly constant rate. The kind of thing where if you measure how fast it is going now, you can reasonably guess where it will be in 50 years. That intuition is exactly what this model demolishes. The decline is not steady. It is 400 years of barely there drift followed by a near-vertical drop. If you were standing inside stage 1, measuring the rate of change and extrapolating it forward, you would calculate a comfortable, distant, manageable future, and you would be catastrophically wrong because the rate of change in stage 1 tells you almost nothing about when stage 2 arrives. The gentle slope is not a small version of the cliff. It is a different thing entirely, and it gives you no honest preview of the speed of what follows. This is why simply watching the current weaken slowly and reassuring ourselves with how slowly it is going is such a trap. Slow now does not mean slow later. It may mean the opposite. Think about what that pattern actually means for anyone trying to live through it. For 400 years, the warning sign is a barely perceptible drift. Slow enough to argue about, slow enough to ignore, slow enough to normalize. And then, almost without transition, the slow drift becomes a violent lurch, and the system that took millennia to build comes apart in about the time it takes a child to learn to walk. There is no dramatic slowing down phase right before the end that gives you a clear final warning. The smooth part of the curve runs right up to the edge, and then there is no more curve. There is just the drop. This is the thing I keep telling you, made concrete and quantified at last. The transition from weakening to gone is not gradual. It is a cliff, and the model just measured the height of it. And the specific mechanism behind that lurch is worth stating plainly, because it ties back to everything we built earlier. Remember that the Gulf Stream is pinned in place by the deep current running south beneath it. Through stage 1, as the amok weakens, that deep current is fading, its grip slowly loosening, and the Gulf Stream creeps north in response. But the loosening is not linear, because of the feedbacks we talked about, the way a weaker current makes the north fresher, and a fresher north makes the current weaker still. At some point that vicious circle outruns the system's ability to stabilize itself. The deep current does not just keep fading gently, it reorganizes, almost all at once, and when it does, The anchor that held the Gulf Stream in place for as long as we have watched it simply lets go. The Gulf Stream, suddenly unpinned, jumps north. The lurch is not the cause of the collapse. It is the visible symptom of the deep engine finally failing underneath. The 219-kilometre jump is what it looks like from the surface when the heart of the global conveyor gives out. Now, a model is a model. It is an idealized world running under simplified conditions, and a skeptic would be right to ask the obvious question. So you found a scary pattern inside a computer. So what? Computers can be made to show all sorts of things. Does any of this actually correspond to the real ocean, the one outside the simulation, the one we actually live on? That is exactly the right question to ask, and it is the question that turns this from an interesting academic exercise into something that should genuinely hold your attention. Because the team did not stop at the model. They took the two-stage fingerprint they had found, the signature of a Gulf Stream being nudged north in stage 1, and they went looking for it in the real world. They went looking for it in 30 years of data we had been quietly collecting the entire time from satellites watching the ocean from space, and they found it. Part 8. The Fingerprint in 30 Years of Light. Here is the thing about the deep ocean. We cannot watch it directly, not in real time, not across a whole basin. Sending instruments down into the abyss and keeping them there is extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily expensive, which is why the rapid array, as remarkable as it is a single line across a single latitude. We do not have a live, continuous, ocean-wide view of the deep circulation. We never have. But, and this is the quiet genius of the whole approach, we do have exactly that kind of view of the surface. We can watch the position of the Gulf Stream from space, continuously, in near real time, because the Gulf Stream leaves a mark on the surface of the ocean that satellites are very good at seeing. The instrument that does this is called a satellite altimeter, and what it measures is the height of the sea surface, with astonishing precision from orbit. The ocean is not flat. Warm, fast-moving currents like the Gulf Stream actually sit slightly higher than the colder water beside them, and there is a sharp step in sea surface height right across the edge of the current. So by mapping the height of the sea surface from space, you can pick out exactly where the Gulf Stream is, trace its path and track how that path moves over time. And we have been doing this faithfully since the year 1993, more than 30 years of continuous satellite observation of where the Gulf Stream sits. On top of that, scientists have temperature measurements from beneath the surface going back even further, to 1965, giving an even longer reach on the same question. So the Utrecht team took their fingerprint, the stage 1 signature of a Gulf Stream drifting slowly northward as the deep current weakens, and they laid it against this real-world record. They asked the simple, devastating question. In the actual ocean, over the last 30 years, has the Gulf Stream been drifting north the way stage 1 says it should? And both lines of evidence, the satellite record since 1993 and the subsurface temperatures going back to 1965, gave the same answer. Yes, the Gulf Stream has shifted in a way that is statistically significant, not noise, not a wobble, a real directional trend. It has moved north by roughly 53 kilometres since 1993. 53 kilometres in about 30 years. I want to hold us right here for a moment, because everything in this video has been building to this single number, and it is easy to let it slide past too quickly. The model predicted that if the Amok were entering its decline, the Gulf Stream would begin to creep north in a slow stage 1 drift. And when we look at the real ocean, that is precisely what we find. The Gulf Stream's present position is right where the model says a stage 1 system should be. We're not looking at a forecast here. We're not looking at a projection of what might happen in some distant scenario. We are looking at a measurement of where this current sits today, and it sits in the place the model associates with the early stage of the road to collapse. By this reading, we are not approaching stage 1. We are in it. I think it is worth appreciating just how elegant this whole chain of reasoning is, because it is a beautiful piece of science even though its conclusion is frightening. Start at the end and walk it backward. We cannot see the deep current directly, but the deep current pins the Gulf Stream in place. And the Gulf Stream, when it is pinned and when it drifts, changes the height of the sea surface above it, and the height of the sea surface is something a satellite in orbit can measure to within centimetres. So a chain of physical connections links the invisible deep circulation, kilometres down in the black, to a number that a spacecraft can read from hundreds of kilometers up in space. The health of the most important current on the planet, a thing we could never watch directly, turns out to be legible from orbit if you only know what you're looking at. That is the kind of indirect, clever, deeply satisfying inference that good science is made of. The tragedy is only in what the reading says, and notice the quiet horror folded into the timing of all this. The satellites have been measuring sea surface height since 1993. The connection between the deep current and the Gulf Stream's position has been sitting in the textbooks for years. All the pieces were already on the table. The data was already being collected faithfully, orbit after orbit, year after year for 3 decades. What was missing was not the measurement. It was the understanding of what the measurement meant. We had been photographing the warning sign continuously since the early 1990s, filing the images away, and only this year did someone finally hold the model up next to the archive and realize that the warning had been developing in plain sight the entire time. 30 years of evidence gathered before anyone knew it was evidence. Hold on to that feeling, because by the end of this video it is going to turn into the most important question I can ask you. Now I have to slow down, because this is the exact point where responsible and irresponsible coverage part ways, and I promised you I would stay on the responsible side of that line. It would be incredibly easy, and frankly it would get more clicks, to take that 53-kilometer number and the model's timeline and turn it into a countdown. So let me tell you very plainly what this research does not say, because the restraint is the whole point. It does not give us a date. We do not know how far through stage 1 we are. We have only had this satellite data since 1993, so we are looking at a 30-year slice of a process that may have been quietly underway for much longer than that. We can see that the Gulf Stream has drifted 53 kilometers in our window of observation, and that this matches stage 1, but we cannot see how much drift happened before 1993, and we cannot read off exactly how close the lurch of stage 2 might be. The data tells us where we are. It does not hand us a clock. There is a figure from the model that I have to share, because it is the one that gets pulled out of context and weaponized, and I would rather you hear it from me with the caveats attached than see it screaming from a thumbnail somewhere stripped of all its meaning. In the model, stage 1 ends approximately 25 years before the full collapse. So, in the idealized simulation, once you are in the slow drift phase, you have got roughly a quarter-century of runway before the violent lurch, and I can already feel how that number wants to land. 25 years, a countdown, a deadline. But please, hold it loosely, because that figure carries enormous uncertainty, and treating it as a prediction is exactly the mistake to avoid. Here is why. The model is running under deliberately idealized pre-industrial conditions, with only one thing changing, fresh water being added slowly and steadily. The real ocean is nothing like that clean. The real ocean is being warmed and freshened and shoved around all at once. It is dealing with rising temperatures, shifting wind patterns, changing atmospheric circulation, and freshwater input from Greenland, all simultaneously, all interacting in ways the simplified model does not capture. On top of that, the single biggest factor in the real timeline is how fast Greenland keeps melting, and that is itself a wide-open question that depends on choices not yet made and physics not yet pinned down. So the honest range is genuinely broad. The window to a possible collapse could be considerably longer than the model's 25 years. It could also, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, be considerably shorter. We do not know. Anyone who tells you they know the year is selling you something. I also want to give real airtime to the honest scientific disagreement here, because it matters, and because pretending it does not exist would be its own kind of dishonesty. Not every expert agrees on how close we are, or even on how to read these signals. There are serious, careful researchers who think a full collapse this century is unlikely, who point out that the high-resolution model is still a simplified world, that the satellite record is short, and that natural variability could account for some of what we are seeing. There are other serious, careful researchers who have published estimates putting a possible collapse alarmingly soon, within the lifetimes of people watching this. The truth is that this is a live, unsettled scientific question, and the responsible position is to hold that uncertainty honestly, rather than collapse it into whichever answer is scarier or more comforting. What almost everyone in the field does agree on is narrower and still significant. The current is weakening, the freshwater driver is real, The system has a tipping point, and we are now, for the first time, able to watch a meaningful signal of its approach. The disagreement is about the timing. It is not about the direction. So let me be as precise as I can about what we have actually gained here, because it is important and it is real, even with all the uncertainty stacked around it. What the Utrecht research delivers is not a countdown. It is a mechanism and a model, and for the very first time, a physically grounded, satellite-observable proxy for the health of the most important ocean circulation system on the planet. Before this, we had a speedometer that could tell us the current was slowing. Now we have something closer to a fuel gauge, a way to read, from space, whether the system is sitting in the dangerous early phase of its decline. And when we point that new instrument at 30 years of data we already had, data we had been collecting the whole time without fully understanding what it was telling us, the reading is not reassuring. It says we are in stage 1. The drift has begun. The warning light, the one we did not even know how to read until this year, is on. And there is one more layer to sit with before we move on, because it makes the whole thing feel less like a distant abstraction. This is not a warning about a far future generation. The satellite drift we are talking about, that 53 kilometers, has happened within the lifetimes of most people watching this. If you're old enough to remember the early 1990s, then the entire observed northward march of the Gulf Stream that the model associates with Stage 1 has unfolded in front of you, in your own adult life, recorded the whole time, and you simply never had reason to notice. This is not your grandchildren's problem in some textbook sense. It is a process that started its measurable phase when many of us were already alive and paying attention to entirely different things. That is what makes the new instrument so quietly unsettling. It does not point to a distant horizon, it points at the recent past, and it says the thing you were told to think of as a far-off risk has, in fact, already been visibly underway for a generation. And that reframes the entire question, doesn't it? For the whole length of this video, we have been asking how close we are to losing this current. We finally have a tool that can begin to answer it, and the early answer is that we are further down the road than is comfortable, which means it is time to ask the question we have been carefully circling the entire time. The question that turns this from a fascinating piece of oceanography into something that should make the hair on your arm stand up. If we did lose it, if the Gulf Stream's slow drift north did one day become the violent lurch of Stage 2, and the Amok disintegrated the way it did at the end of the last ice age, what would that actually mean? What does the world on the other side of this current's collapse actually look like? Because it is not subtle, and it is not far away from where most of you watching this live. Part 9. The World on the Other Side. Let us go back to the very first thing we talked about, the line on the map. Europe is warm in defiance of its latitude, because this current delivers it a continent's worth of borrowed tropical heat. So the simplest way to understand a collapse is to ask what happens when you stop the delivery. You take away the heat, and the answer is that the geography reasserts itself. The map stops cheating. Europe is handed back the climate its latitude actually deserves, and that climate is brutal. Without the heat the Amok pumps northward, average winter temperatures across northwestern Europe would fall by something like 10 degrees Celsius. 10 degrees, as an average, across an entire winter, across an entire region. That is not a bad cold snap. That is a different climate. That is the difference between a place where life goes on through the winter and a place where winter becomes the central organising fact of survival, and it would not stop at temperature. As the North Atlantic lost its warmth, sea ice that is today confined to the high Arctic would begin to creep southward, reaching down toward the coastlines of Britain and northern Europe, waters that have not seen ice like that in the entire span of human civilization there. Let me make it concrete, because averages are easy to shrug off. London, a city that today rarely sees a hard freeze, a city of mild grey drizzle, and gardens that flower most of the year, could face winter temperatures as low as minus 20 degrees Celsius. Picture that. Picture the Thames hard with ice. Picture a city built for damp, mild winters trying to function in the kind of cold that today belongs to the deep continental interior. And further north it gets worse still. Scandinavia, with its modern cities and its farms and its comfortable Nordic life, could be transformed into a tundra colder than parts of Siberia. The countries that today rank among the most pleasant and prosperous places to live on Earth would be handed a climate closer to the empty cold expanses we instinctively think of as uninhabitable. The line on the map we drew at the very beginning of this video would stop being a curiosity and start being a forecast. And here is the part that turns a regional cold disaster into a civilizational one: the growing seasons. Northern Europe has been an agricultural heartland for centuries, one of the great reliable breadbaskets of the modern world, and that entire agricultural system rests on the mild climate the current provides. Drop the winter temperatures by 10 degrees, push sea ice toward the coasts, shorten and chill the growing season, and that system does not just struggle, it can simply stop working. The fields that feed a huge share of a continent would no longer reliably grow what they grow now. You would be asking one of the most densely populated, agriculturally productive regions on the planet to feed itself in a climate it was never built for, more or less overnight in geological terms. The infrastructure of survival, the farms and the supply chains and the cities they support, would all be standing in the wrong climate. And there is a cruel twist buried in the timing of a collapse like this, one that makes it even harder for people to wrap their heads around. We are living through a warming world. The headlines, the records, the heat waves all point one direction toward hotter. So the idea that one of the great consequences of climate change could be a sudden, brutal cooling of Europe sounds, to most people, like a contradiction, even a hoax. It is not. It is one of the strangest and most genuinely difficult things about this whole subject. A warming planet melts Greenland. The meltwater chokes the current stops delivering heat to Europe, and a corner of a warming world plunges into cold. The global average keeps climbing while one of the most important regions on Earth freezes. Imagine trying to build the political will to act on that, trying to explain to a public baking through hotter and hotter summers that the danger is, of all things, a deep freeze. The counterintuitive shape of the threat is itself part of why it is so easy to ignore. There is also a piece of this that lands much closer to home for anyone on the American side of the Atlantic, and it tends to get lost behind the dramatic images of a frozen London. When the amok weakens, water that the current would normally carry away begins to pile up against the eastern seaboard of North America. The result is an extra, accelerated rise of sea level along the United States east coast, on top of the global rise already underway, concentrated on exactly the stretch of coastline where a huge share of the country's people and property and infrastructure sit. Boston, New York, the whole low-lying mid-Atlantic. So this is not only a story about Europe's winters, it is a story about higher tides and worse coastal flooding for tens of millions of Americans, driven by the slowing of a current most of them have never thought about for a single second of their lives. But if you think this is only a European story, you have not yet seen how far the damage reaches, because the AMOC does not just warm Europe, it is woven into the circulation of the entire planet, and when you pull on it, things move on the other side of the world. As the North Atlantic cools, the great tropical rain belts, the bands of reliable seasonal rainfall that hundreds of millions of people farm beneath would begin to shift. The monsoon systems that deliver the rains to West Africa and to South Asia would weaken and drift southward. And those monsoons are not a luxury. They are the difference between harvest and famine for some of the most populous regions on Earth. We're talking about disruption to the food and water supply of well over 1 billion people on continents far from the North Atlantic who have never heard of the Gulf Stream and would never imagine that their harvest depends on the saltiness of water off the coast of Greenland. That is how connected this system is. A current failing in the North Atlantic could help dry out the fields of South Asia. And then there is the ocean itself, the food web in the water. Remember the upwelling, the way the circulation drags cold, nutrient-rich water up from the deep ocean to the surface around Antarctica and in other regions. That upwelling is not incidental. It is what fertilizes vast stretches of the sea. The nutrients hauled up from the deep are what feed the phytoplankton, the microscopic drifting plants that form the very base of the entire marine food web. Everything in the ocean, every fish you have ever eaten, every whale, every seabird, ultimately rests on that foundation of phytoplankton fed by upwelled nutrients. Weaken the circulation that drives the upwelling, and you starve the surface waters of those nutrients, starve the phytoplankton, and you knock out the bottom of the food chain, and everything stacked above it, potentially across large regions of the ocean, can begin to collapse with it. A weakened current does not just chill Europe and dry out the monsoons, it can reach down into the base of life in the sea and pull the floor out from under it. And I think the hardest thing to hold in your mind about all of this is the speed mismatch between how the system fails and how human societies adapt. Civilizations can adjust to almost anything if they have enough time. Give a region 2 or 3 centuries to shift its agriculture, move its cities, rebuild its infrastructure for a new climate, and it can painfully manage. The terror of the 2-stage pattern is that it does not offer centuries for the hard part. It offers a long, ignorable drift and then a violent lurch, and the lurch can play out on the timescale of a couple of decades, faster than farms can be relocated or coastlines abandoned or whole economies retooled. The mismatch is the danger. A slow problem we could handle, a problem that masquerades as slow for 400 years and then moves at the speed of a single human career, is one we are profoundly unprepared for. Not because the consequences are unimaginable, but because the timing gives us no room to respond once the response finally feels urgent. So when we ask how bad it could get, the honest answer is that it is hard to find a part of the human world that a full amok collapse would leave untouched. A frozen, food-stressed Europe. Failing monsoons across Africa and Asia, threatening over 1 billion people. A faltering ocean food web. Shifts in storm tracks and a faster rise of the sea against the entire east coast of North America, which I have not even fully gotten into. This is not a regional weather story. It is a story about one of the master switches of the planetary system and what happens to everything downstream when it is thrown. And I want to be fair and careful here, the same way I have tried to be all along, because the scenario I have just walked you through is the full collapse, the worst case, the far end of the road. Many scientists think a partial slowdown this century is more likely than a complete shutdown, and a partial slowdown would be milder than the picture I just painted, though still serious, still bringing regional cooling and rising seas and shifting rains. So I am not telling you the frozen Thames is scheduled, I am telling you what is on the other side of the tipping point, because that is what gives the 53-kilometre drift its weight. The reason a slow northward creep in the position of one ocean current deserves an hour and a half of your attention is that this is what sits at the end of the road it is on. The stakes are not abstract. They are a continent's climate, 1 billion people's food, and the base of life in the sea. Which brings me, finally, to the question that I think actually matters most. And it is not really a question about oceanography at all. We have a mechanism. We have a precedent written into the ice. We have a brand new instrument that says we are in the early stage of the warning. We have known this current was weakening for over a century, and we have had the satellites watching the Gulf Stream drift for 30 years. The science, in other words, has more or less done its job. So the real question, the one I want to leave you sitting with, is not whether the amok could fail. It is why a species that can see something like this coming, in this much detail, this far in advance, finds it so strangely, almost fatally, difficult to act on what it sees. Part 10. The Quiet Filter. Here is something strange about us, about human beings, that I think sits underneath this whole story. We are extraordinarily good at one kind of thinking, and almost comically bad at its mirror image. We understand, instinctively and deeply, the idea of asymmetric upside, the notion that a small bet might carry a huge payoff. We feel it in our bones. It is the thrill of buying a lottery ticket, the dream of being discovered, the fantasy of putting a little money into the right small company and finding the next giant. A tiny cost, a vast possible reward. That shape of risk is exciting and motivating, and we spend a remarkable amount of our lives chasing it. It lights us up. Now flip it over. Asymmetric downside, a small cost, a small change in behaviour that might avert an unbelievably negative outcome. The same shape of bet, just pointed the other way. And at this, we are dismal. We struggle to feel it. We struggle to act on it. The clearest little example I know of is home insurance. Roughly a quarter of homeowners in some countries choose not to buy it. We have all heard of house fires, of floods, of the freak event that takes everything someone owns, and still a huge fraction of people look at a modest, certain cost today to protect against a catastrophic, uncertain loss tomorrow, and they decline. Not because they are stupid, because the human mind simply does not light up for avoided disasters the way it lights up for possible jackpots. A catastrophe that does not happen leaves no mark, makes no memory, gives us nothing to feel good about. So we discount it, and we discount it, and sometimes we discount it right up until the day it isn't avoided anymore. And notice that this is not a flaw in any one person. It is not stupidity, and it is not laziness, and pointing fingers at individuals misses the point entirely. It is a feature of how the human mind evolved. baked into all of us. For almost the entire history of our species, the threats that mattered were immediate and vivid. The predator, the storm, the rival. The minds that survived were the ones tuned to react fast to what was right in front of them, and to mostly ignore the slow and the statistical and the far away. Because for most of our history, the slow and the far away never killed you before something faster did. That instinct is still running in every one of us, beautifully optimized for a world that no longer fully exists, and it means that the hardest threats for us to handle are precisely the ones that arrive slowly, invisibly, and without a face to blame, which is, unfortunately, an almost perfect description of a current weakening across centuries beneath the surface of the sea. Now scale that flaw up to the size of a planet. We have never had to pay for the climate and the ocean and the stable conditions we inherited. They came free, a gift from a few thousand years of unusually steady Earth, and none of us, not one single living human, has ever witnessed a globally significant event like an amok collapse, because it has not happened in recorded human history. So it sits in the worst possible blind spot of the human mind. It is the ultimate asymmetric downside, a small set of changes now against a catastrophic loss later. And it is a kind of catastrophe none of us has ever seen, which makes it feel, on some animal level, unreal. Exactly the kind of threat we're built to ignore. And the reason this blind spot is so dangerous is that the cost of acting early is almost always tiny compared to the cost of acting late. And yet early action feels, in the moment, like a waste. This is the heartbreaking arithmetic of every slow catastrophe. The cheapest moment to deal with it is always the moment when it feels least real, when the threat is still distant and abstract and arguable, when the people urging caution can be dismissed as alarmists because nothing has obviously gone wrong yet. And the moment it finally feels real, feels undeniable, feels worth acting on, is almost always the moment when acting has become vastly more expensive, or simply too late. We are built to wait for the proof, and for this kind of threat, the proof and the point of no return tend to arrive at very nearly the same time. By the time the ball is visibly going over the wall, the window to keep it in the valley is already closed. You can watch this play out in miniature in almost every part of human life. The maintenance we skip until the thing breaks, the checkup we put off until the symptom is undeniable, the small, dull, unglamorous expense we refuse for years, only to pay 100 times more for the emergency it would have prevented. None of this is because people are foolish. It is because the human mind is exquisitely tuned to respond to what is vivid, immediate and certain, and almost blind to what is gradual, distant, and merely probable. That tuning served our ancestors well on a savanna full of immediate dangers. It serves us catastrophically badly when the danger is a current weakening over centuries, visible only in 30 years of satellite data that you need a supercomputer to interpret. We are using a mind built for the leopard in the grass to try to see the leopard that takes 100 years to cross the field. There is an idea in cosmology that I find myself thinking about a lot in this context. It is called the Great Filter. The basic notion is this. The universe is vast and old and, as far as we can tell, silent. We do not see the galaxy teeming with other civilizations, and one explanation for that silence is that somewhere along the path from simple life to a long-lived, star-spanning civilization, there is a barrier, a filter, that almost nothing makes it through. Some step in the journey that, again and again, kills off the travellers before they reach the far side. We do not know where the filter is. We do not know if it is behind us or still ahead. When we imagine that filter, we almost always imagine it as something cinematic. An asteroid out of the dark. A war that ends everything in an afternoon. The engineered pathogen. Something that arrives with drama and spectacle and demands an immediate all-hands response. And maybe one of those is out there. But I have come to suspect that the loud, dramatic threats are not actually the most dangerous ones, precisely because they are loud. A threat that announces itself with enough force tends to get a response. We are good at the asteroid. We are good at the thing with a countdown clock and a clear villain. The quieter version of the filter is the one that worries me. I think civilizations probably do not usually fail because they miss the big dramatic threats. I think they fail because they miss and then normalize the slow ones, the threats that do not arrive with a bang but seep in year after year, slow enough to argue about, slow enough to get used to, slow enough that there is always something more urgent on the screen today. the threats whose warning signs hide inside the smooth part of the curve, right up until the curve runs out. A great filter does not need to be a fireball. It can be a tendency, a flaw in how a mind built for jackpots and predators handles a danger that moves at the speed of geology. And that is what makes the Emmok story feel, to me, like more than a story about an ocean current. Look at what actually happened here. We have known this current was weakening for over a century. We have had satellites watching the Gulf Stream drift for 30 years. The signal was there the entire time, sitting in plain sight, hiding inside data we were already collecting for other reasons. We were not blind. The information was on the table. What was missing was not the data. It was the recognition, the act of finally looking at the 30 years of numbers we already had and understanding what they were quietly telling us. And it took 1,000 times more expensive model and 6 months of a supercomputer just to teach us how to read our own existing data. The warning was not hidden by nature. It was hidden by our own difficulty in seeing slow things, and I do not want to leave you only with the weight of it, because there is something genuinely hopeful folded into this story too, if you look for it. The hopeful part is that we found it at all. Think about what actually happened here. A handful of researchers, with a clever idea and a very expensive computer, managed to extract a clear warning signal from data that had been sitting unread for 30 years. That is the human mind doing the thing it does best, finally turning its formidable powers of pattern and inference onto a slow threat and dragging it into the light. The same species that is so bad at feeling slow danger is also the species that built satellites to watch the ocean from space and supercomputers to simulate it, and the whole apparatus of science that let someone connect the two. The blindness is real, but so is the sight. We are capable of seeing these things coming. The Utrecht work is proof of that. The open question is not whether we can see. We just demonstrated that we can. The question is only whether seeing will be enough to move us, and that part is not written in any data set. It is up to us. So where does that leave us, honestly? It leaves us with a current at its weakest in 16 centuries, a mechanism we finally understand, a precedent carved into the ice from the last time it failed, and a brand new instrument telling us we are standing in the early stage of the warning, with a stretch of road ahead that nobody can measure precisely. It could be long, it could be short. We do not get to know. We do not, as the researchers themselves are careful to say, have a countdown. What we have is the thing we never had before, which is the ability to see, at all, that we are on the road. And whether that recognition has come early enough to matter, or already too late, is the one part of this that we do not get to simulate. There is no 10-kilometre model of the human response. There is no supercomputer that will run the next 50 years for us and tell us how it comes out. That part we just have to live through. We are the experiment now. The satellites will keep watching the Gulf Stream creep north, 53 kilometres and counting, and the only variable left that none of us can predict is what the species watching the gauge decides to do about it. Which leaves one last question, and it is the one I genuinely cannot stop thinking about, and the one I want to leave with you. We found this one because somebody finally spent the money and looked. The warning had been sitting in our own data for 30 years, quiet, patient, ignored. So if a threat this enormous could hide that long in plain sight, in numbers we already had, kept invisible by nothing more than our own trouble with slow and undramatic things, then the obvious and uncomfortable question is the one that should keep all of us up at night. What else are we missing? What other gauges are sitting right in front of us, reading quietly, in data we have already collected, waiting for someone to finally understand what they have been trying to tell us all along?